I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. Magazine land is a tough world. Major titles have all had to shift online and rethink how they attract audiences. Many haven't survived, and the ones that have done so because they know their audience and they produce quality content. One of those is Money Magazine, Australia's longest running and most read personal finance magazine. This morning on Fear and Greed, we're talking to Money Magazine's editor-at-large, Julia Newbould. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Sean.
So what are the big issues in the world of personal finance at the moment?
Well, I guess the big issues are really recession-proofing your finances, what you can do if you lose your job. They're our big worries for our readers. Mm-hmm. When a market's going to recover, obviously they're asking that all the time. And where should they put their cash if they need to keep that buffer for themselves?
All of those are very, very personal examples. When you're writing a personal finance story, it is very personal. Are you thinking about someone? Are you thinking about situations? Like, what goes through your mind as a journalist?
Definitely. A lot of it comes from conversations that I have with friends or things that I overhear, even on public transport these days. We get a lot of letters to the editor as well, with people asking Paul what to do at different times. So I try and make it things that are interesting to me and also interesting to the people around me at different ages and employment situations.
I think it is an interesting, I've been a journalist as well, and often you can get very caught up in trying to impress others, but the stories that really do resonate are the barbecue stories, I think, the ones people want to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. And it's all about, at the moment, JobKeeper and JobSeeker and what am I entitled to and what can I get and, what's going to happen when it stops. And that's where people's heads are right now.
Now, I'm going to take a couple of the yarns that you've written recently and perhaps go through them. I'm fascinated with the FANG stocks. They're the US stocks, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix and Google, or Alphabet. They've run incredibly hard, and Apple, for example, is worth $1.8 trillion. Its market cap is $1.8 trillion. Why do you think they've done so incredibly well in recent months? And I suppose, can people actually invest in those?
Well, yeah, people can invest in them, but I think why they've done well is because everything's changing in our market. And where we had the blue chips in Australia, a lot of the banks, the dividends are being cut and people are having to think of different ways to invest and make their money. And perhaps they're not going to make money on dividends anymore. And so they're looking at other kinds of blue chips and looking at how they can maybe make money from capital gains in the future. And obviously most of us gone online now and we're looking at tech things and how our economy and how our society is changing. And it becomes so relevant to invest in these stocks right now.
And just a warning here, we're not financial advisors, so if you want to invest in these things, you should talk to your financial advisor. But do you think some of these tech stocks will keep running? Are they worth investing in?
I think, yes, they are. And I think that most of them are quick thinkers. They're always thinking of what's next. And you look at, Apple and they're intuitive to the market. So, yeah, I think it is an area with a future.
What about some of the Chinese stocks, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent? Are they things that Australian investors can put money into?
Yes, they can, especially through ETFs. But I think they're really the ones to watch at the moment because they've been very focused internally. And while that's great because there's such an enormous market in China itself, we don't know what they're trying to do next. And that's an area to watch, I think.
Now, you mentioned ETFs, exchange-traded funds. For the listeners, just explain what they are.
It's a way of getting into the stock market by buying a group of stocks that are in a certain area, and you can buy an ETF that focuses on FANGs, and the ETF securities offer is FANGs and BAT companies, and it tracks the index. And so instead of having to pick the individual stocks, it includes things like Tesla as well. It's an easy way to get into the market.
So you can put 10,000 into an ETF
and
effectively get exposure to Tesla, as you mentioned, and Apple, Netflix, Google, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, that type of thing.
Yeah, and it's traded again through the stock market.
Right, very easy. Bringing back to a more practical level, another thing that you've written recently is about when it's the right time to start giving kids money. And at this point, we're talking about older children rather than the younger ones. Whether you should lend them money or give them a gift in terms of perhaps buying a home, whether early inheritance is a good idea, if for no other reason, then they can top up their super. What's your take on all that? Is there a rule of thumb that people can follow within a family?
Yeah, there's a lot of rules of thumb, really. I think, number one, you've got to make sure that as a parent, if you're thinking of giving an early inheritance or you're thinking of lending your kids money or giving them money, can you really afford it? Because, the costs of healthcare and aged care in the future may be expensive, so you can't get rid of all your money because you may need it down the track. So really that's something you should perhaps see a financial planner or at least work out your own finances as to whether you do actually have enough for the next generation. And the other thing is, are your kids ready for it? So a lot of parents obviously want to help their children get into the property market, and if you're living in one of the major cities, it is very expensive, and for a lot of people, there is no other way of getting in unless they have help from family members. But unless your kids have really shown an aptitude that they can actually save and put aside money to pay back the mortgage, they might not be ready for you to help them get into the market. So there's a lot of considerations to make. And then as a parent, if you have more than one child, can you afford to do it for all the children equally, or are you going to cause family problems? That's another issue that we look at. Another issue is that as a parent, if you're lending or giving your child money for a property and they're partnered, what happens if down the track they break up with their partner? Do you have recourse over that money to get back for your child, or does that go into the split pool? So, those areas really highlight the need to get legal advice as well and draw up contracts, even if it is family.
It's not just financial, it is emotional, some of these decisions.
Oh, absolutely. And depending on what you do, if you give one child something now and then you think you're going to make up for it in the will, but it's not really explained properly, it can cause all sorts of family dramas down the track that you might not be around to deal with.
Yeah. And what about family trusts? I've never had one, or my family's never had one, but are they worthwhile?
In certain situations, yes, they are. Again, you need to get advice for them. A lot of it's tax related and who gets what when and who would be better earning the interest on investments and so on. So it's a very complex area.
So take advice, basically.
Take advice, yeah.
Now, what about younger children? My children are a little bit younger than that. And you wrote recently that it costs an estimated $300,000 to raise a couple of kids in 2020. And I reckon you were being conservative. I'm sure I spend more than that. Well, I will over the 18 years, particularly when you take into account schooling and medical expenses, insurance, accommodating them, feeding them, that type of thing. Where did the figure come from? And do you think you're being too conservative?
I guess the figure is a bit averaged because we don't know, whether you're going to send kids to private schools, what their health situation is. For some, having multiple kids doesn't make much of a difference with the cost, whereas, for others, it does when you start looking at the private schools.
Is schooling the biggest expense for many people?
Yeah, private schools are very expensive. If it's, around some of the top schools are around $30,000 a year. So you have a couple of kids going through, yeah, it's pretty expensive.
So what should parents do? Is it something that they should be thinking about when you have a child and in very early years actually start putting money aside? Is that the best option?
It is a good option to start putting money aside, but just to figure out how you're going to afford it. So, are your other obligations too much? Can you afford a certain amount of money out of the pool once you're paying your mortgage and your transport and whatever else? And if you have more than 3 kids and you have to get special cars and so on, it's another expense that you need to just factor in and be aware of. And do you need 2 incomes to sustain the lifestyle and so on?
Do you think people mostly think about this stuff, or it occurs to them later on?
I think some do. I think our readers are very conscious of how they're going to afford everything. Other people, not so much. And, people seem to manage, but you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself if you don't have some sort of plan. And I think the economy now is really testing people who are very highly leveraged.
Have you noticed from your readers in the last 3 or 4 months when coronavirus has really hit, and particularly you've got people in Victoria, that they've sort of become more focused on more fundamental things like paying rents and paying mortgages and that type of thing?
Yeah, they're very focused on it, and they want to know everything that's available to them in government subsidies and assistance. And they want to know how they can pull back on other expenses. And yeah, it's number one focus.
Actually, I mean, it's a good point. Is there any trick to pulling back on expenses? I'd love to spend less between paychecks, but God, it's a hard thing to do.
I've recently published a book called The Joy of Money with financial advisor Kate McCallum, and one of the things we talk a lot about in there is conscious spending, just making sure that everything you spend is something that you want to spend money on. You know, is it you're stopping at the petrol station and you're picking up a few snacks that's on the way, or you're buying bottled water and so on? Is that really a good thing for your life? Is it giving you pleasure? And the things that you're not really getting pleasure out of, maybe cut back on them. So there's things like that. And also, I think people are becoming very nostalgic for old times and thinking about recycling, which is, you know, good for the environment, but also, you know, good for the hip pocket, and repairing things. We've become very cavalier in what we throw out, thinking, well, that's broken, it's scratched, it's torn, it's, you know, whatever. Whereas a lot of things can be repaired and reused.
I think that's a whole new topic, Julia. I'm going to ask you on again in a little bit to go through how to make savings. Look, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed this morning.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Money Magazine's editor-at-large, Julia Newbould.